Welcome to the Wordy Pair Podcast, your go-to hub for all things writing, world building, and the occasional dive into the weird and wonderful world of fiction. We're breaking down the barriers between you and your next great story. Whether you're a seasoned scribe or just scribbling your first sentences, we've got something for you. We'll be discussing everything from crafting compelling characters to dissecting the good, the bad, and the downright bizarre in the world of fiction. Okay, this script says you guys are eccentric. Isn't that just a 3-syllable word for weird? No offense. So, whether you're in need of inspiration, a good laugh, or just a couple of weirdos to keep you company on your writing journey, you're in the right place. Thanks for tuning in to the Wordy Pair Podcast.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Wordy Pair Podcast. We are talking about random writing stuff, and this week we're going to be talking about a book. As always, I'm Rudy.
And I am not a Martian, but Justin.
No, you're a Venusian.
Yes,
Fishman.
I am a Venusian.
Yeah, the book we're talking about this week is going to be, it's called Massacre of Mankind. It was written by Stephen Baxter, and it was like an approved by the H.G. Wells estate sequel to Wells's War of the Worlds. Which,
all right, good talk.
If you look at the end of the book, at the afterword, he does mention that there are a couple of like unofficial sequels to War of the Worlds, but this one was actually like, this was an officially sanctioned sequel, and Baxter went to a pretty decent amount of work to try to kind of capture that early 1900s H.G. Wells kind of world building, because obviously the book was written much, much later than it takes place. Let's see, the copyright on this one says 2017. So you have to forget an awful lot of what we think we know about about science and the solar system in a world that H.G. Wells created in the early 1900s.
Yeah, because he goes into a lot of detail about life on places such as Venus, which we all know are, that's definitely a place that could harbor life in oceans fairly easily.
Well, we know now that that's not going to happen, but like back in the day, we didn't have the instruments to necessarily make all of those conclusions.
Exactly.
And so, lacking a proper spectroscopic understanding of the emission spectrum of the clouds on Venus, it might be assumed that they are some kind of, watery clouds. Later on we've discovered that they were actually sulfuric acid, which makes things a little bit more difficult for life. But in the words of another famous science fiction writer, life finds a way. I mean,
Not on Venus it doesn't.
No, not on Venus it doesn't.
See, he wasn't using the full quote. The full quote was, life finds a way everywhere except for Venus, not on Venus. It doesn't find a way there. That's the full quote.
Yeah. I mean, so now we have a pretty good understanding of kind of like what the temperature of the interior of Venus's atmosphere is, and it's something ridiculous, like 800 Celsius or something like that. It's really, really hot there because not only are they much closer to the sun, but they also have an atmosphere that's very good at capturing and holding on to heat, and so their emission is inhibited, leading to a greater collection of heat on the interior of the planet. So back when Wells was writing, it was kind of there was kind of this prevailing, not like scientific understanding, but this like prevailing reasonable understanding that planets further out were going to be colder and planets closer were going to be hotter, but the extent was not, I think, known very well. Certainly wasn't known by the general public. And so there were a lot of books written at these times that talked about, the life on the potential for life on Venus and Mars as the two planets closest to, the Earth's distance from the sun. It might be, it was at least hypothesized that, some kinds of creatures may have adapted to the rather extreme temperatures and atmospheric conditions in both of those places.
Well, all the way up until the time that we actually were able to take images from Venus, from beneath the clouds, the tasty sulfuric clouds. All the way up until that time, people were convinced that, when they got these images back, that they were going to see, like, jungles and lush landscapes. There were a lot of people that did believe that Venus would be a thriving, life-filled planet. And
I think
it seriously...
I mean,
it wasn't like...
Through spectroscopic methods, it's way easier to understand that Venus is, 800 Celsius and not 100 Celsius. It's way easier to do that than to get a probe actually onto Venus, which happened... When did a Venus probe... I mean, someone did that once. I think it was the Russians.
It was the Russians, yeah. But there were still people that thought they were going to find jungles on Venus when that probe landed, and then they finally saw the pictures and was like, oh, no, barren wasteland.
Well,
and now it's falling apart. Okay.
Yeah, the Soviet Union's Venera probes captured our only images of Venus's surface, and yeah, I mean, I think that the scientific consensus was that there's probably not any life there, but again...
Oh, yeah, I mean... It was just like the idea is that at the time, that was a relatively late time compared to when War of the Worlds came out.
Yes.
But this was a prevailing view that people had of what might be on Venus, and so...
Well, I mean, the Venus probes were 1975 and 1982, so by then probably the general public was aware that Venus was way too hot to sustain life, but there still was...
it was like
curiosity.
Up until the 1950s or something, people thought that there were going to be jungles on Venus.
Yeah.
But the way that Stephen Baxter wrote the book was one of someone from the perspective of being in the same era as the first book. Because what does it take place 10 years after the first book?
12, I think. But yeah, 12, it's pretty close. Yeah. I mean, he basically had to take all of the assumptions in the world building that Wells used and make those assumptions in his world building as well, which is an interesting exercise.
And he took the exercise to some pretty big extents because the book is very largely fleshed out by the details of what the technology is that the Martians used, what kind of life is on the other planets, how that life interacts with the Martians, how the ecology of Mars interacts with Earth's ecology. There's a lot going on in this book, and it's like a reimagining of science-style hard science book, or rather jumping back to an older understanding of science to write a hard science
Yeah. I mean,
book.
This is one of those things, I mean, it is possible to not understand the full implications of modern scientific understanding of various things. But, like, it's also possible, it's also true that people were writing things about science fiction. They were speculating about the possibilities of certain scientific things before those things were well known. I just did a short video about this where I was talking about how if you don't understand general relativity very well, then, and if you don't have if you don't have any progress toward like a grand unified field theory of like the different forces, then it's possible to believe, for instance, that there's forces that we haven't figured out yet, that we haven't observed yet. And it's also possible to believe that certain things might have speed limits faster than light or slower than light. So, like, it's not a trivial conclusion. I mean, it's fairly trivial, but you have to get pretty deep into actually looking at general relativity to get to it. Is to find that, like, say, if a gravitational wave exists, that it also propagates at the speed of light, which nails down two of the forces, and the only two that work at extended distances. And, we now have an understanding of the different forces that make the universe tick. And, we kind of have them classified into 4 different types. And only 2 of those, gravitation and electromagnetism, seem to have extended operation over large distances. And finding out that both electromagnetism and gravitation send signals at the speed of light means that you're learning that the speed of light is basically a universal speed limit for everything at distances. It's possible to write stuff before you know that, and so you can hypothesize that there are different forces that have a different speed limit, for instance. it's also possible to do things like not understand that reducing the mass of a thing to zero locks its speed to the speed of light per general relativity. And therefore, you can do something else. You can say, well, I've locked the mass of this thing to zero, but I haven't locked its speed to c, because I don't know that you have to do that scientifically, quote unquote. And so I can use a different methodology to come up with a velocity for this thing. For instance, in the Doc Smith books that I'm reading, what he does, or what he says that they do, is they equalize the thrust and drag forces for a massless object, basically. And so you have thrust and you have the drag from the interstellar medium. When those two forces equal out, you get the speed that the ship goes at. And of course, that there's no reference to general relativity or the speed of light in those equations. Therefore, you never come up with this speed limit. And if you just put the right size rockets on the right size ship and put it through a rare enough medium, then it goes faster than the speed of light, at least, hypothetically.
Well, you are ignoring the one force that tends to get overlooked in this, though. And that's the one that's like, it actually does work fine that way, but it's like when Wile E. Coyote runs off a cliff, he's fine until he looks down. So as long as you don't look at those equations, it'll all work out.
Well,
That's how that works.
Not if you're trying to write something that actually, has reference to the real world.
Well, that's just Looney Tunes.
No, your method is the Looney Tunes, by definition.
Oh, crap, you're right. Okay. Yeah. I'm glad we got that sorted out. So, yeah, what is the Massacre of Mankind?
Well, so point one. The world building of this book assumes that if Martians and Earthlings are going to send people, to the opposite planet, that they're going to do so at the points where the planets are closest to each other, right? So,
right. So
that means that
this was kind of the premise.
Yeah, that means that any like matter-based communication between the two planets happens basically once every 4 years, and so kind of the book starts out talking about how after the first, what do they call it?
After the War of the Worlds.
Yeah, after the War of the Worlds, there was a lot of worry 4 years later, and a lot of observation of the surface of Mars 4 years later to determine whether they were going to be launching another set of cylinders at the Earth to invade again. And in fact, 4 years later they did not. 8 years later they did not. But this book starts out about 11 years later, and that's kind of where our plot begins. Is the main character's name is Julie Elphinstone, I believe, and she's a journalist, I guess, is the way to describe her. This book kind of, with some interruptions for other things that other characters told Julie, quote unquote, happened. This book is mostly about her adventures in the second attempt by Mars to, second and third actually attempts by Mars to take over the world.
Yeah, the story kind of starts out with someone not making a discovery, but someone. They essentially have observed the Martians getting ready to do another launch, and so they know when it's coming, they know when to expect it. They're preparing for it, but they don't know if they're really ready for it. And
yeah, I mean, the main character of the War of the Worlds is a character named Walter Jenkins in this book, and he is kind of like he's the one that gets Julie into the situation. Basically, he calls her and has her come to Europe and meet with him, and he says, "Yeah, we've got evidence that the Martians have fired more cannons at Earth, and we're expecting, instead of 10 cylinders, 100 cylinders, something like that."
And it's important to pay attention to just what the technology is like, because this isn't like a Will Smith movie with like high technology aliens invading Earth with its lower technology and starting a war with it. The Martians have their own distinct technology, and it's comparable to technology on the Earth, with the exception that their weaponry is better, and they have a completely different evolution of mechanics of machinery, which has an interesting explanation later in the book.
Yeah.
They have a different way of thinking about things because of the way they structure their society as opposed to ours. It's mentioned towards the end of the book that because they're a telepathic race, they don't really... It's hard to copy their technology because they don't have anything written down, because essentially they have the mental equivalent of an oral tradition.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Because if one of them knows something, it's easy to share the information, and then, it propagates throughout the species and becomes this like species memory, except it actually is real memory being transferred.
Yeah, the memory is individualized, but it spreads
Yeah.
losslessly, basically, between individuals.
Yeah, so the way that they build their machines as well, there's a character that gets introduced later in the book that's kind of observing how the Martians act, and one of the things he mentions is that, we as people have a tendency to like to go back to old ways sometimes, and this seems apparent in the way that the Martians kind of designed their vehicles. They didn't use wheels or treads or anything like human vehicles.
Yeah.
And he makes the assumption that they designed their vehicles based on actual creatures from Mars that they might have used for industrial purposes before becoming industrialized.
Mm-hmm.
And before building the machinery. So like they must have had, say, 3-legged creatures that they would ride on the back of and use them to do manual labor. And so their machinery reflects that, in that they have these 3-legged monstrosities that carry them around and do a lot of their labor for them and carry their weapons.
Well, these are all hypotheses by characters that don't actually know whether these things are correct or not.
But it's...
Because there's also
it's
a
put in the book
hypothesis that in the book it's mentioned that, like, the Martians probably don't remember when they were pre-industrial, because it was so darn long ago. That's another kind of assumption of the old model of how the solar system kind of coagulated, would be that Mars, in addition to being colder than Earth, is also older than Earth, and therefore any civilization that had been on it had already kind of reached the pinnacle of what it could with the knowledge that it was able to generate. They say that, for instance, the heat rays that they bring with them this time are basically the same as the heat rays that they brought with them in War of the Worlds, and the explanation that's given is that, well, they've already perfected all this technology, they just brought more of it this time.
Yeah, well, they observed that it was very effective the first time, so no reason to improve on it. And that actually, I enjoyed the part where they were crossing the English Channel,
mm-hmm.
and they mentioned that they actually have an advantage over the Martians with their heat rays. They're traveling on the sea, and they're like, they have to have line of sight, so their heat rays have a bit of a disadvantage, whereas we can hit them with artillery from beyond the horizon where they can't see us.
Right.
So it's obviously it's not a perfect weapon, but they didn't feel the need to bring any others, and that's reflected pretty strongly in the story, because the heat rays are really effective at taking things down when they need to.
Yeah.
I mean, even though they had that artillery advantage, they were still... first they were blindsided by the fact that they didn't expect the aliens to enter the channel.
Right.
And they actually did, and Stephen Baxter likes to use locations to effect in his stories, and
mm-hmm.
so they're standing... I forgot the name of the bank, but there's a bank in the channel that is not as incredibly deep as the rest of the channel that the aliens...
it's less than 100 feet deep, which is the extent of the machines. Stephen Baxter uses locations to affect, and he also uses locations to not affect, which is one of the things I found irritating with the early part of the book, where, like, Julie would go to a new city and she would just, like, name drop a bunch of monuments but not describe any of them.
Oh yeah, that's true.
That was a little bit irritating, but
I guess geography he used to affect very well.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, the thing about artillery, non-line of sight artillery, is that you still need spotters, and it's very hard for spotters to get around, to get close enough to the Martians, and then also to send signals to someone with over the horizon weaponry. Right? That was the main problem that they had. That's why the Martians, quote unquote, snuck up on them, is because they didn't have anybody watching that area of the channel to say, "Oh yeah, there's Martians there now."
Yeah.
And so by the time they observed, hey, there are Martians there, surprise, surprise, they're within line of sight.
There's a few things that he does throughout the book where he's observing the differences between Martians and humans, and I'm not so sure that, like, I liked a lot of the things he did. I thought it was a good book, but I also thought at points that he was dragging it out too long.
Mm-hmm.
But it came away with some pretty neat explanations for what the Martians were doing. Like, he had this part in the book where he talked about the Martians were trying to breed into humanity, basically turn them into a slave race by breeding out any loyalty to each other and doing experiments to find who would and wouldn't be willing to sacrifice their fellow man for their own self-interests.
Yeah, right.
And this was... It was brought up because it was demonstrating what likely happened to another race that they enslaved and brought to Earth to help them grow their food.
Right. There's a race of, like, humanoid... There's a slave race of humanoids from Mars that they brought over as well, both as food and to cultivate the red weed, which they're using to do another thing, which it turns out later on, we learn at the very end of the book what they're doing with the red weed.
Yeah, I feel like they hinted at what they were doing with it pretty early, like when they first talked about it. But that I guess that was kind of... Even that was close to the end of the book. Maybe 3/4 of the way.
Yeah.
But yeah, there were like several stages of the Martians' plans, and he just kept opening new doors for what they were doing the more the characters traveled around and ran into these situations with what was going on with the Martians.
Yeah, I mean, so what happens... Like, initially they get... I think they get 100 cylinders hitting England entirely. So it starts out with, like, a repeat of the first book, in the sense that just kind of on a larger scale. And with a little bit of technological, innovation, or strategic innovation, I guess. Right? Instead of just landing themselves in the cylinders, they drop bombs first. And then they drop the cylinders into the places that the bombs dropped, so that they have already cleared out kind of an area for themselves to start to sortie from. And, I mean, England believes that it knows what it's doing to fight them, and turns out that it is basically wrong. I thought it was funny that they didn't use that much of the... I mean, like, there's only 1 or 2 scenes in the first part of the book that describe how the English Navy used long-range, over-the-horizon weaponry to try to fight the aliens, and in neither case was there really that much of an effect on them. So... Like when later on they were like, oh, by the way, the advantage we have is we can shoot over the horizon. It's like, well, you certainly should have been using that more, or using it to better effect, because in the first third of the book, you guys use it and it doesn't work very well.
Well, even when they're crossing the channel, they pretty much get smoked, and quite literally.
Oh, they do, of course, because they don't have spotters, right?
Yeah,
that's the problem. Is that what they find out is that the Martians have some way to detect, like, signals or machinery, and they'll basically aim for any signal generating things or machinery, and so you get a communications blackout, which prevents people at the front lines from properly painting targets for the over the horizon weaponry.
Yeah. Fail Britannia, you never ruled the waves.
But it's a fun book. It covers over a 4-year interval, because we actually get 2 separate invasions in this book, which is kind of cool. We get the 100 cylinder invasion, and we get the 1,000 cylinder invasion, and both of those have different effects and make different results. And humanity is kind of on the ropes until they have a really cool idea that they implement, and it manages to get the Martians to retreat for a while at least.
Well, I'll say it's an effective idea, but as far as really cool goes, I don't know. It kind of felt like that was pulled out of nowhere, and I also feel like the character who came up with the idea threw away a very good opportunity.
I guess.
I guess at the end of the book, the original plan that they were going to use to fight the aliens, they decided they were going to take to an intergalactic level. Mm-hmm. Or at least a space level where they would, instead of... So at one point in the book, they're going to try to essentially attack the aliens with a beefed up version of the virus that killed them off in War of the Worlds.
Right.
And after they achieve a victory through another method. I believe it's briefly mentioned that, well, they can reverse engineer these capsules that the aliens launch themselves to Earth in to send back to Mars with the virus and use it to attack them on their home turf, which would
really funny. It was really funny how so the quote unquote carrier of this virus is Julie Elphinstone, the main character.
And, I don't understand why it was just supposed to be one person, but whatever.
Well, I mean, maybe she just wasn't privy to other possible attempts, but it doesn't look like there were any other attempts because, she was the only one that anyone ever talked about through the whole book. But it's really funny how she was like, I can't believe that we're going to use this disease to destroy the Martians. And it's like, dude.
They're literally eating you.
They're literally eating people. And, this is, it wasn't, we have to be careful because people nowadays will be like, oh, humanity re-engineered the virus to make it more potent. It's like, no, that's not actually what happened. What happened was that they figured out which particular bacterium was the lethal one in England in War of the Worlds, and then they basically went to Africa and found a slightly more virulent version of that already was within humanity, and then just gave it to one person to have her go in and infect them again. And she refuses to, which is really strange. And then she also refers it as to like a poison in her blood. But they already say to her, that it's not, it doesn't affect humanity. That humanity is just as immune to it as it was to the one that killed the Martians the first time. And so it's like, there's this weird...
To be fair, it was the government telling her this, so I could understand her trepidation.
Yeah, but I mean, like, it's...
But yeah, they put all their eggs in one basket, and she's still worried about it, and then she's like, she's got to come up with this alternate plan to deal with it, because an alternate plan, by the way, which is so based on the whims of a supposed group of people that they have never met before, that it's ludicrous that she's just like, you know what, we can still, she should have been like, we'll do the other plan too, but maybe I should go ahead and do the one that we're already in a position to succeed with.
She has at least two opportunities throughout the book to implement the virus plan, and she does not. So
yeah, and for stupid reasons. Like
yes.
The worst part is, like, at one point, she's literally thinking to herself, well, actually, they're doing horrible things to our children. And they've got this whole weird breeding program that they're trying to implement, and they're experimenting with humans. And then she's like, but I just can't commit genocide.
It's not. It wouldn't even be genocide. It's just the Martians on Earth, which is a small fraction of the Martians that are in existence.
That just makes it funnier, though, because then it's like, but if we commit genocide on their home planet, that's okay, because now we're just going to send the virus there.
Well, I mean, she wasn't part of those. She wasn't part of those talks. Right?
That's true. That's true.
Like she had no control over that, whether it happened or not, or whether it was planned or not. But like the fact that she's like, oh, I wouldn't want to kill 100 Martians here on Earth. That would just be, that's just a bridge too far. Number one, it's not genocide. The Martians have a thriving civilization on Mars itself. Number two, it's not poison in her blood. It's a bacterium that humanity is just as adapted to as the earlier one that killed them. And she has like. Again, she has at least two opportunities to contaminate their blood supply with hers, and she just chooses not to because she just can't bring herself to indiscriminately kill these 50 Martians.
Which is funny in itself because she has gone through all these horrors of war leading up to the moments where she could have done this. Like, she's watched people die that she's been working with.
Yeah.
She shed tears over many of them.
Yep.
She watched innocent people die. She watched another alien race being enslaved and being made into docile food supplies. And she speculated on humanity at some point in the future being similar to them. Right. And she was still like, nah, but I'm not a jerk. I wouldn't want
to hurt these 50 Martians that arrived on Earth. Just it's a bridge too far.
I'm sure they're just misunderstood. So, needless to say, I didn't think much of her as a character. And honestly, she's a little irritating and not very good as a... She doesn't make a lot of sense. Yeah. But she was a journalist, so I guess it did track.
It is accurate, yeah.
Yeah.
In that sense.
I think that there weren't really too many characters that I did care about. Like, the characterization in the story was not the strong point, for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, we can... I don't think it matters if we spoil it. Do you want to talk about what the end goal plan ended up being?
Well, I mean, it's a little bit left open, right? It's like because it's not sure. Okay, so here's kind of here's the big spoiler at the end. Humanity takes a bunch of explosives and draws a circle on the surface of the Earth, a circle that is so large that it is visible from space. What that does is it puts us in the same bucket as the people of Jupiter, because astronomers observed a perfect circle on the Great Red Spot. And I don't mean like a perfect like circle. I mean like a ring, like a perfect ring on the Great Red Spot of Mars, not Mars, Jupiter. And the world building is that, well, the Jovians must be much wiser and stronger than the Martians, and therefore, if we draw a circle on the Earth, the Martians will believe us to be allied with the Jovians, and the Jovians basically tell Mars to back off. And so the Martians don't leave the Earth. There's a thought that they leave the Earth because they seem to disappear. But what they actually did is they actually went up to the Arctic, and they started growing a bunch of their red weed, and the red weed is basically sequestering the Earth's atmosphere. It's turning the oxygen and nitrogen in the Earth's atmosphere into nitrous oxide. And then storing it in bubbles in this red weed. And it's unsure whether this is like an actual plan to try to eradicate humanity, like a little bit more indirectly, or if it's like an attempt to say, hey, this is a thing that we have, so you'd better come up with a way to kind of, coexist with us in some way. And it's left kind of open whether they're going to do that or not.
Yeah.
Like at the end of the book, they're like, well, we don't really know how it's going to go, but we're going to find out. And then the book ends.
Yeah, and they also don't really come to a conclusion whether or not the Jovians would make good allies to begin with, but it solves the immediate problem. Because they're not sure if the Jovians are like benevolent or if they're just like, thinking of their own interests. Like, okay, Mars has already conquered Venus essentially, and now they're trying to conquer Earth. How long before they think they can come knocking on our door? And I don't quite understand why where that logic came from, but it's pretty much presented as a given that the Jovians are ludicrously more technologically advanced than the Martians.
Yeah.
And
well, the reasoning for that is the same reason why the Venusians are more primitive and the Martians are more advanced than Earth, right? It's that picture of how the solar system kind of coalesced. Is that, well, Jupiter is older and colder, but also wiser and probably more powerful if there's anyone living there. And they know that someone's living there because of that ring that appears on the red spot. So they're like, okay, well, let's just kind of signal that we're allied with the Jovians. And if anyone is going to strike fear into the hearts of the Martians, it's going to be the Jovians. There's no other group out there, because they mention at the very beginning of the book that somehow they know that Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto don't have civilizations on them anymore.
Yeah, and that's the kind of thing that really gets me about this alternate plan. Like, you had several opportunities to implement the plan that was probably going to be somewhat effective, but you went with the plan that was reliant on the whims of the Jovians, the belief that you interpreted the signal of the Jovians correctly. I mean, for all you know, that circle was probably... For all you know, that circle could have just been like them turning power on a city. or something, or like just them...
No, because the circle appeared as a reaction to the symbol appearing on Venus. I mean, I think there's a pretty, like... It is a bit of a leap of logic, but I think it's not as much of a leap of logic as you're making it out to be. Like, they're seeing these specific symbols appear in a certain time frame, and they're like, oh, this is these things are related.
Maybe so, but there wasn't really any direct line to, if we make this signal, maybe the Jovians will react to it.
Oh, sure. I mean,
so the entirety of the plan...
There's no reason for the military to bow to the whims of a goofy journalist who refused to kill Martians.
Yeah.
and follow her plan instead. The only thing that could make them do that, I think, would be desperation. And since it became clear that she wasn't going to, kill the Martians, it was kind of like, okay, well, I guess we'll try it. There's no harm in trying it. We're kind of up against the wall anyway.
Well, I mean, it did work, so
yeah,
there you go. But
Person of the Year,
yeah,
Time Person of the Year,
definitely.
Julie Elphinstone.
And she wrote the article herself.
Martians are people too.
And there's like the cover of Time is like a Martian chewing on a baby.
Yeah. Well, no, it's Julie Elphinstone chewing on a baby because she's the Person of the Year. Obviously, she's on the cover.
Yeah. Wait, why is she chewing on a baby? Who
Why
knows?
not?
She's a journalist. No, they're
Exactly.
just like, she's a journalist, and they just leave it at that. It's like,
No, everybody leaves it at that. They're like, oh yeah, it makes sense.
yep.
That tracks.
But then everyone's like, wait a minute, the Martians eat babies too?
The Martians eat everybody.
Yeah, you're actually surprised to find out the Martians eat babies, but not the journalists.
Right.
So yeah, so that's kind of Massacre of Mankind. I mean, there's not too much to the story in terms of, what actually happens, but the way that the story unfolds is the fun part, because it does read like a really askance view of hard science based on different interpretations of science.
Well, based
from
on
days
old
past.
knowledge, old understandings of things.
Yeah.
I mean, that part of the book is interesting just because of the effort that had to go into it.
Yeah,
if you look
he
at the
clearly
afterword,
put a lot of effort into it.
He read a bunch of books from around those times about what people's kind of general understanding of the structure of the solar system was and how it evolved, kind of thing. And so, to immerse yourself in that kind of old stuff is, an interesting project. It would have been. It's funny that he immersed himself in all of that old stuff, but didn't immerse himself in any old notions of right and wrong and justice. Right? We've got this journalist who's like, oh man, it'd be really wrong for me to kill these 150 Martians after we've lost tens of thousands of people. But
that would not have been the prevailing sentiment of the time, even among journalists.
Yeah, among anybody basically. So it was a little bit of a. It seemed anachronistic to me to a certain degree that she had so much empathy for these, and it wasn't even like they were going to necessarily kill a huge number of non-combatants, right? Almost all of the Martians were combatants, and we only see small numbers of the humanoids, and the humanoids are not in the machines, so the humanoid Martians must be able to take on some level of Earth disease. The Venusians definitely can, because the Venusians have a different body structure from the Martians, and we can assume that whatever science the Martians used to make themselves immune to the bug that got them the first time was not given to the Venusian slaves, and probably not even given to the Martian slaves. And so, she would have just killed 150 Martian combatants, and that's about it. Plus the number that had budded in the couple of years that they existed. But that's it. It was not a large number.
Yeah, ever since that first time where she was like, no, I'm not going to do this when she has the opportunity, every single time something horrible was happening and she was talking about how horrible it is, all I could think of was her saying, if only there was something I could do about this.
Yes. Won't somebody please think of the children?
Yeah.
But I mean, aside from Julie Elphinstone being a bit of a jerk, the rest of the book is pretty darn good. I mean, we have.
Oh, the beginning. The beginning of the book is really.
The beginning of the book is really good. Yeah.
Yeah, because it really kind of builds on the events that happened in War of the Worlds and fleshes them out a bit more.
Yes.
It's got a really nice atmosphere for the first third of the book. It's really it almost it has the atmosphere that the radio program had, almost.
Yeah. There's also a decent number of fairly interesting side characters, right? There's Julie's co-journalist. What's his name? Harry something?
Yeah.
He's much more interesting than she is, but he gets a lot less of a part in the book. We have what's his name? We have Walter Jenkins himself. We have Walter's brother Frank, who I guess is Julie's ex-husband. but he's a medic on the front lines, and so he gets basically trapped in England as the Martians take over, and he gets some interesting parts in the book. The way that the book kind of works is that Julie got quote unquote journals from a lot of these characters, and so every couple of chapters there will be a chapter that is from someone else's perspective, and those ones are often a lot more sympathetic and interesting than Julie herself. But there's a good amount of content from a good number of different points of view, at least, and it doesn't preach at you that much. It's just that Julie is a little bit anachronistically suicidal.
Yeah. I think... I mean, Frank's parts of the story were some of the more... What can we call it? Adventuresome, and
yeah.
He was the one that was giving the story about being on the English Channel, trying to cross, and being on the Navy boats that were under attack.
Right.
And I can't remember the name of the character that was doing all the observation of the Martians.
You mean the traitor?
Yeah.
Bert something? Yeah.
Yeah, it was Bert something. Well, Bert Cook.
Bert
I think it was
Cook.
Bert
Yeah, that's
Cook.
right.
And he was... There was quite a lot of detail in his part of the story where he was talking about his different views on what the Martians were actually doing and how they reacted to, at one point, there's a part of the story where
there's no linguistic communication between humans and Martians, right?
Yeah.
The kind of the cover story for Julie's second adventure into England, 3 years after the drop, is that she's going to try to show them glyphs that Walter came up with, and hope that they can kind of communicate. And that's the cover story for her being there. Whereas what she's actually supposed to be there to do is to mix her blood in with their blood supply and infect them with this disease. But the fact that there's no communication between humans and Martians means that we need a human narrator to tell us what the Martians are doing. And Bert Cook has a good role as that, basically.
Yeah, and he's presented at first as someone that, I think, was it Julie that just wasn't very fond of him? I think so.
Yeah, I mean, at the very start of the book, nobody's really fond of him, but he's kind of like a war hero, right?
Yeah.
And so then later on, he kind of sides with the Martians to a certain extent. But it's mostly for, the start of the book, he kind of shows himself to be kind of a selfish egotist, and that character trait gets carried on to the second part of the book, where he's, basically said, well, humanity's going to get eaten for the most part anyway. If I can stay alive and kind of push things in a certain direction a little bit from my end, then, well, that's what I'm going to do, kind of thing.
Yeah, and he has some interesting ways of handling situations. Like, he's the one that talks about how the Martians are curious about humanity's loyalty to family and things. And so they were doing experiments to see what would happen if they placed groups of family together and put them in X situation, and then placed groups of strangers together and put them in X situation. And at one point they're trying to, they're crawling around, and there's these people that find out that he's Bert Cook and they don't like him, and so they're kind of shouting at him, and he starts throwing these rocks at them, and it turns out that these rocks are actually arrowheads taken from a museum, and he starts talking about how the Martians don't really view these arrowheads as anything special because we don't really use them as weapons or anything, so the Martians aren't concerned about them. Right. And, it's almost implying that, if it came down to it, we could build weapons that the Martians wouldn't even think of as weapons. But that's not really, his point there. The point is that he reacts by throwing these arrowheads at people that, kind of want to strangle him. And it looks like he's, doing them a disservice.
Yeah.
It looks like he's attacking them, essentially. But part of his explanation for things that these arrowheads could be for these people that were in dire straits is he's like, yeah, I mean, if you've got nothing else to live for, it's nice to have an option for a way out. And so he's
Yeah.
basically tossing them these sharp stones that the Martians won't suspect of being anything that is a weapon, so that if they want to, they can kill themselves. And
Right.
that slightly alters Julia's opinion of him in terms of, it's like, oh, he's actually a little more sympathetic than I thought.
Mhm.
So,
Well, kind of, sort of. It's weird that this particular perspective works on Julie, considering how like worried she is about like Martian lives. You'd think that she'd
yeah,
be like,
right?
no one should ever take that easy way out. But like from the perspective of the reader, it's like, oh, he's giving them an option where they had none, and they might they there's nothing that he can do more than that to make their situation any better, because he's basically treading on thin ice himself. He's like, I pointed at people a couple of times and led Martians to them, and then they dropped one of these things down, and I had to have the courage to step onto it and be like, yep, I might be dead now. It's like,
Right.
it's one of those things where, sure, he was not like a good guy in the traditional sense, but at the same time, he was an interesting character because he was so, I guess, like, consistent, maybe?
Consistent and
And he had an interesting perspective. He had a perspective that was not something that I kind of was expecting. And so, it was like, ooh, this is actually interesting, and not just like, kind of what I expect to be happening.
yeah, and even him throwing these arrowheads at people was a demonstration of, how he was kind of playing the aliens in ways, because
Yeah.
he was acting like he hated these people and he was not loyal to them or anything, or had no sympathy for them. But he
Right.
was doing something that the aliens could not perceive as being sympathetic towards them. And that was a
Yeah.
lot of what he was talking about during his portion of the story,
Yeah.
was the way the aliens think and the ways that you can maneuver yourself to fool them.
Right. And that's also one of those things that I kind of thought was interesting, just because it's like, well, he's not just helping the aliens. He's trying to make sure that they don't learn as much as they want as fast as they can, right?
Yeah.
Like he's mildly sabotaging them as well, which was, kind of an interesting little development.
Yeah, so I mean, all in all, I would say that he might have been the character I found most interesting, because it got to him, and by that time you had met several characters that were, very straightforward, and there wasn't much to them, and it's like, okay, this is just the characters with the names that we need to move the story along, and then it gets to him, and you're expecting the same, so you're like, oh, okay, so this guy is just kind of a jerk here sitting at his desk, and then as his portion of the story unfolds, and you learn a little bit more about how he thinks and how he's been observing the aliens and what conclusions he's come to, he actually becomes probably maybe the deepest character in the story, maybe the one with the most substance to him.
Maybe, yeah.
Yeah, that's part of what makes the story interesting. A lot more of what makes it interesting is the descriptions of technology, both human and Martian. And
Yeah.
I mean, there really isn't much technology for the Venusians. They have a lot of scenes where the book is pretty long, so there's a lot of scenes of them traveling from point A to point B. At one point, they end up in underground tunnels. They end up in caves. They end up in different parts of the world. They're in America at one point, then they're in England, then they're in Germany, and they even end
Yeah.
up in the what was it, the North Pole?
At the very end, yeah.
Yeah.
Basically.
And so there's a lot of scenes of them like being underground, and Martians show up, and so they're having a fight against a Martian with one of the heat guns underground, and talking about the different ways that the combat happens.
Hmm.
They end up having to someone sacrifices themselves with a grenade to bury the alien attacker at one point.
Right.
There's a lot of, I don't want to say like, not really like a spy novel, but there's lots of, oh, well, the aliens don't really know we're here, and we're trying to get from point A to point B, and we're amongst a group of people that the aliens do observe.
Hmm.
It's just,
Yeah, there's some
interesting
decent
situations
and some
suspense.
fun stuff going on. Yeah, I thought the apparently one of the aspects of the story that pops up later in the like last third of the book is that there's like an American trend of writing like pulp short stories.
Oh
in
yeah,
which
yeah.
Thomas
I had a good
Edison
laugh
is
at
the
that.
main character. Yeah, it's good stuff.
Yeah, yeah. Thomas Edison was one of the characters had written a book about. I think it was Frank wrote a book about Thomas Edison
No,
building.
it was Harry.
Oh, was it Harry? Yeah, Harry wrote a book about Thomas Edison building weapons of war to fight the aliens, and he's
Right.
talking to someone at a party, and they're like, "Oh, you're the one that wrote that book that was about Thomas Edison building the weapons of war," and he's like, "Yeah, it was kind of ridiculous, but I mean, it just seemed to fit." And he goes, What has Thomas Edison been up to?" And he goes, "He's been building weapons of war to fight the aliens."
Well, it's not just that because they mention that this is like an entire like trend in short stories. They call them Edisonades, right?
Yeah.
And like everybody is writing these stories that are getting serialized in magazines and stuff, where like Thomas Edison does something amazing, and it's not all about him fighting the aliens, but he's kind of like the Doc Savage of the book.
Yeah, War of the
in some
Worlds
sense.
replaced like Doc Savage and what's his name, John Carter.
Yeah.
And Conan the Barbarian. All of those were replaced by Thomas Edison in the world of War of the Worlds.
Yeah. But yeah, it's kind of interesting. Like we get to see the aliens attack. We get to see a little bit of the aliens attacking a bunch of other places other than England as well. There's kind of this chunk in the second half of the book where there's just like this montage of chapters of like one short chapter from like the perspective of every major landing place across the world where the aliens are dropping. So you get like South Africa and Australia and there was one in South America, I think? Question mark? There was one in Russia, stuff like that.
Yeah, a whole bunch of them.
There was one in Shanghai as well, I think. So yeah, there were a bunch of these little short chapters, which they don't quite fit in with the rest of the book, but they're just kind of a neat appendix, I guess.
Well, I think they're kind of there just to build up the idea that things are starting to really heat up, and then building up for the withdrawal because of the Jovians.
Yeah.
Because I mean, really, they sometimes in the book you didn't have a sense of just how big the war was.
Yeah.
Because they didn't really. You don't see much of what's going on with the aliens except for like this one portion of the story where there's a camp that the aliens are overseeing where people are basically farming and sometimes being plucked away as though they're in the midst of vampires.
Yeah, yeah.
But yeah, it was kind of just a nice build up for the end, for when they're like, "Oh yeah, look at the dire straits we're actually in," and then we appeal to the Jovians for a bit of like the Jovians just kind of come in with a rolled up newspaper, like, hey, what do you think you're doing?
Yeah.
They actually refer to it as like someone who's being bullied at school calling in their uncle. And I just pictured this weird looking Jovian dude with like walks in and starts taking his belt off, and he's like, "What have you Martians been up to?"
Right.
Yeah, we don't actually see the Jovians at any point in the story.
No, I mean, the way the story is set up is that it actually kind of is fodder for another sequel at the end, which maybe Stephen Baxter will write one day, and maybe not. Who knows?
Yeah, I guess we'll find out. I mean, usually
and maybe it'll have to happen another 100 years later when somebody will get permission from both the Wells and the Baxter estates.
Yeah. But it happens during a Martian attack.
No. The world actually proceeds the other way around. We land on Mars and find out that there are aliens there with a civilization, and we destroy them accidentally. and so then this writer has to be like, oh, so when Wells wrote his thing, people thought there might be Martians. And then when Baxter wrote his thing, people were sure that there weren't Martians. And now that we know that there were Martians, but we killed them all by accident. Okay, I'm going to have to really work on this one.
And from the Martians' perspective, all they really saw was, hey, they wrote 2 books about us and they kind of painted us as jerks. Oh my god, we're all dead.
Yeah.
It was propaganda. It was
all propaganda the whole time. Yeah, it's an interesting book. It's I would say that if you like War of the Worlds, that this is definitely worth checking out because it is the official sequel. And that it's silly, but that does mean something because it means that, there wasn't this massive legal battle over someone using elements of Wells' story and determining which parts of those elements were in copyright and which ones were not, kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
Because, you could have an unofficial sequel to War of the Worlds, but such a thing would probably get bogged down in... War of the Worlds by now is in the public domain, I think, but, at the same time, if it were something a little bit closer, right? If it were only 70 years old, then there'd be this massive fight about who has the rights to write this thing. But, here we have, an established science fiction author, Baxter, writing with permission of the Wells estate. And so it's a nice collaboration that, appears to have gone pretty smoothly.
Yeah, it's definitely one I could recommend to people. I recommended it to you.
Yeah.
And that was only with having read half of it.
Right.
I'm not actually... So my introduction to Stephen Baxter was stumbling upon the Long Earth books that were that were co-written, Terry Pratchett and Stephen Baxter.
Yeah.
And, I keep... Terry Pratchett obviously isn't writing anymore because he's no longer around.
Right.
But I didn't even know those books existed, and I had been... Up until the very last days of Pratchett, I was following everything he did, and somehow they just never got on my radar. Probably because I was thinking that everything he was writing was Discworld.
Yeah.
But, that was where I first heard of Stephen Baxter, and so I'm like, who the heck is Stephen Baxter? And I didn't bother looking into it, but I was at a used bookstore, and I just happened to stumble across The Massacre of Mankind, and I was like, oh, it's an official sequel to War of the Worlds. Well, that sounds interesting. And then I look, it's like, there's Stephen Baxter again. Yeah. Who the heck is this guy? He's working with Terry Pratchett. The next thing I know, he's writing a sequel to War of the Worlds. I have yet to read any of the man's own personal, science fiction stories. I think I need to, though. He's, I like the way that certain other authors handle certain things a little better, but he's good. He's very good, and he puts a lot of effort into fleshing out whatever world he's in.
Yeah.
I think I think that's his strong point as opposed to characters. I'm not so sure that... Well, we'll put it like this. It was obvious what characters Terry Pratchett was really focused on in The Long Earth.
Sure.
But...
Well, so apparently Baxter wrote the Time Odyssey novels with Arthur C. Clarke, so those might be worth checking out for me, at least.
Yeah, those are the ones that I'm actually looking at on his website right now, but I need to go through and just see... it looks like he's got a pretty decent amount of books out there that I should go through and read. Maybe this is the new author I've been looking for to read for a long time now. Mm-hmm. He just wrote a book in October. He just released one.
What's it called?
Fortress Soul.
Okay.
S-O-L?
Soul like S-O-L?
Yeah. Which bodes well for nothing.
I don't know why you'd need to put a fortress around the sun, but, give it a shot.
Yeah, so yeah. I could probably say that Stephen Baxter is a safe bet based on what I've read so far.
Yeah.
And I can definitely recommend all the things that I've read by him so far, so...
Which would be this and the Long Earth novels.
Yeah.
Or Long Earth?
The Long Earth. It's called The Long Earth.
Okay.
I think there's 3 of them.
Okay. Good stuff.
Yeah, so anything else we have to say about Massacring Mankind?
I'm in favor of it.
No, we do have one more thing to say. So I'm sitting down reading this book, and I'm sitting there like, my dad's got the TV on. I'm just kind of chilling in the living room, and I'm reading, and I just, I happen to close the book just enough to where you can see the cover while I'm reading. Mm-hmm. It's dead silent, but for the TV, and all of a sudden I hear my dad just bust out laughing, and I look up at the TV thinking something funny is happening, but it's just on a commercial, and I look over and my dad is cracking up, and he goes, He goes, have things really gotten that bad that you're reading a book called The Massacre of Mankind, Justin?
You have no idea. This is volume 4.
Oh, it was funny. It was because it was the weekend, so I'm just hanging out over in the living room, and
yeah,
I just worked the previous day, so I'm sitting there reading this book. It's like he just cracks up at me reading a book called Massacre of Mankind, because I'm pretty grumpy about work sometimes. So
sure.
It tracks, and I do like my dark humor, so I could definitely see someone raising an eyebrow seeing me reading a book with that title.
Right.
Oh, my dad thought it was hilarious. He did too.
I mean, it is hilarious.
It was solid. Him cracking up.
Good stuff. All right, I guess we'll call that an episode then.
Yeah. We finally did one of our research episodes that wasn't a video game.
Right. All right, everybody. Well, thanks for sticking with us this week. Hope you enjoyed our discussion of Stephen Baxter's The Massacre of Mankind. As always, I'm Rudy.
And I am Justin.
And we will see you next week with some more writing fun stuff. Who knows what it will be? We don't.
Yeah, we never do.
We never do.
We should just say it's going to be something and then not stick with that every single time.
That could be a running gag. I mean, that could totally be something that we start up. Anyway. All right. Have a good week, everybody, and we will see you next time.
Thanks for listening to the Wordy Pair Podcast. Our passion is all things writing, world building, and getting into the weird and wonderful world of fiction. We hope you enjoyed our unique takes. If you did, make sure to like, rate, review, and subscribe to get your weekly dose of writing weirdness. We'll be back soon, but in the meantime, hit us up on Twitter. For Rudy, it's @Rudolph_Cone. And for Justin, @Ninja Mouse Chew. See you next time on the Wordy Pair Podcast.